The war in Ukraine has entered a phase where the front line is no longer the only place decisions are being made. Kyiv has made a deliberate choice to carry the war deeper into Russian territory, and in doing so it is targeting something Vladimir Putin has spent years trying to protect, the sense among ordinary Russians that the war is a distant, managed affair that does not touch their daily lives. That illusion is now under sustained pressure. And the pressure is coming from drones. For the past several weeks, Ukraine has kept up a steady rhythm of long-range strikes against targets deep inside Russia. This is not a single dramatic operation but a campaign, and campaigns work through repetition. Each strike alone might be absorbed by Russian state media and explained away, but the accumulation of strikes week after week is harder to hide and harder to spin. It creates a psychological effect that a single attack cannot, a growing sense of unpredictability, of vulnerability, of a war that keeps arriving uninvited. One of the most striking recent targets was Wildberries, one of Russia's largest online retailers and a major employer, with a workforce estimated around 4 million people. On the surface, hitting a retail logistics company looks like an odd choice compared to striking a refinery or an airbase, but the logic becomes clear once you consider two things. First, Ukrainian officials have said the company's logistics network was being used to move military materials, which gives the strike a direct operational justification. Second, and just as important, Wildberries sits at the center of everyday Russian commerce. Hitting it does not just disrupt supply chains, it reaches into households. It tells ordinary Russians in a very concrete way that the war can reach the parts of their lives that have nothing to do with the military. That is the real point of this phase of the campaign. Ukraine is not simply trying to degrade Russian military capacity, though that remains a goal. It is trying to change how Russians feel about the war on a day-to-day basis. Economic pain and a sense of insecurity are much harder for a government to manage than battlefield setbacks reported in the news, and the Russian economy is not in a position of strength right now. Forecasts about its trajectory are not optimistic, and the strain is starting to show in ways that are visible to ordinary people, including fuel shortages in regions directly affected by the strikes. There are early signs that this strategy is having an effect. On platforms like Telegram, some Russians have started openly criticizing local officials for failing to prepare communities for these attacks. That kind of public frustration directed at the state rather than at Ukraine or the West is unusual in the current Russian political climate, where dissent is heavily suppressed. It suggests the strikes are doing more than physical damage. They are opening small cracks in the narrative that the war is being competently managed and that it is happening somewhere else to someone else. None of this means the Russian state is at risk of collapse, and it would be a mistake to overstate what is happening. There is currently no organized political opposition inside Russia capable of turning public frustration into a mass movement that could challenge the Kremlin's grip on power. Repression has only intensified, and the tools available to the state to suppress dissent remain firmly in place. But even an authoritarian government that faces no immediate threat to its survival still has to manage public mood, especially with symbolic events like the upcoming State Duma elections on the horizon. Managing appearances matters to the Kremlin even when the underlying political competition is not real. If dissatisfaction continues to build, it becomes an additional variable the leadership has to account for, even if it is not the decisive one. On the battlefield itself, the picture is more static than either side would like to admit. Russia's summer offensive has continued, but it has not produced the kind of breakthrough Moscow would need to claim real momentum. Russian forces are still pushing in the Donbas, and it remains their stated objective to take full control of that region, but current estimates suggest that at the present pace, with the resources currently committed, a decisive breakthrough is unlikely. That does not mean Ukraine is in a comfortable position either. Ukrainian forces are stretched thin, and unlike Russia, Ukraine remains heavily dependent on continued Western supplies of equipment and weapons to sustain its defense. One particular gap stands out. Ukraine's ability to counter Russian ballistic missiles remains limited, and Russia has leaned into that advantage, using ballistic missile strikes against Ukrainian cities more heavily than Ukraine can currently defend against. Russia's own constraints are becoming more visible as well, particularly around manpower. Estimates suggest Russian battlefield losses run somewhere in the range of 30,000 to 34,000 casualties per month, a rate that consistently outpaces what the country is able to replace through recruitment. This is arguably one of the most serious structural problems facing the Russian war effort. It is not simply a numbers problem, it is a political one. Ordinary Russians have shown little enthusiasm for direct involvement in the fighting, even when the state offers significant financial incentives. The government has grown visibly more anxious about this gap, turning to campaigns aimed at university students to try to draw more young people into military service. The fact that this kind of targeted recruitment drive is happening at all suggests the usual channels are no longer sufficient. A full mobilization remains an option in theory, but it would be politically dangerous for Putin, given how unpopular the idea of mass conscription has proven in the past. Taken together, these pressures suggest that momentum currently sits more with Ukraine than with Russia, at least in terms of narrative and initiative, even if the front line itself has not moved dramatically. Russia has been embarrassed by its inability to stop Ukraine's long-range drone strikes, and that failure has become its own kind of story, one that undermines confidence in the state's competence even among people who are not inclined to sympathize with Ukraine. If Kyiv continues at its current pace, it has a real opportunity to Keep inflicting meaningful damage on Russian infrastructure that matters economically, from fuel supply to logistics networks tied to occupied Crimea. Crimea in particular carries weight beyond its logistical value. For years, Crimea has served a symbolic purpose for the Kremlin, presented as a peaceful, prosperous holiday destination and proof that the annexation was accepted and even welcomed. Ukrainian strikes aimed at disrupting military logistics through Crimea also chip away at that image, making it harder to sustain the story that the region is calm and secure. That symbolic erosion may matter almost as much as the practical disruption to supply lines. None of this guarantees a particular outcome. The single most important factor going forward is not any one strike, but whether Ukraine can sustain this campaign over time. A dramatic operation followed by silence would have limited long-term effect. Consistency is what turns a strike campaign into genuine strategic pressure, both on the Russian economy and on Russian public opinion. Polling already shows a growing share of the Russian population saying they want the war to end, and continued economic strain paired with continued insecurity could accelerate that shift. Looking ahead, Russian leadership essentially faces two broad paths if this pressure continues to build. One option is returning to the negotiating table, potentially with reduced demands compared to the maximalist positions Moscow has held throughout past rounds of talks, which is part of why those negotiations have stalled for months. The other option is further escalation, doing more to sustain the war effort despite the costs. Which path looks more attractive to the Kremlin will likely depend less on public dissatisfaction alone and more on how long Russia's economy can continue absorbing the costs of a prolonged war, especially as Ukraine works to raise those costs further through exactly this kind of long-range strike campaign. For now, what is clear is that Ukraine has identified an asymmetric advantage in drone warfare and is using it deliberately, not only to damage Russian infrastructure but to send a message to its own international partners, particularly the United States, that it retains real capacity to keep fighting and to keep raising the price of the war for Moscow. Whether that translates into a shift at the negotiating table or a longer war of attrition will depend heavily on factors that are still very much in motion: the durability of Ukraine's strike campaign, the resilience of the Russian economy, and how much longer ordinary Russians are willing to accept a war that no longer feels quite as far away as it once did. It is also worth stepping back and looking at why this shift in Ukrainian strategy matters beyond the immediate news cycle. For most of the war, the dominant narrative inside Russia was carefully constructed around distance and containment. The fighting was framed as something happening on a far-off front, conducted by professional soldiers and contract volunteers, while life in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other major cities continued largely undisturbed. Restaurants stayed open, shopping centers stayed full, and state television worked hard to reinforce the idea that the war was a limited, manageable undertaking rather than an existential national struggle. That narrative has been one of the regime's most valuable tools because it allowed the population to remain largely disengaged from the human and economic costs being paid elsewhere, primarily by soldiers from poorer regions and ethnic minority communities far from the capital. Ukraine's expanding strike campaign directly undermines that narrative by making the war visible in places where it was never supposed to be visible. When a drone strike disrupts fuel supplies in a Russian region or damages a facility tied to a household name like Wildberries, it becomes much harder for state media to maintain the fiction that ordinary life is untouched. This is why the psychological dimension of these strikes may ultimately matter as much as their physical effects. Infrastructure can often be repaired relatively quickly. A shaken sense of security and a growing awareness that the state cannot fully protect its own population are much harder to repair, and they tend to linger in public consciousness long after the physical damage has been addressed. There is also a broader strategic logic connecting these strikes to Ukraine's position in the war more generally. Ukraine cannot currently match Russia in terms of manpower or in terms of the sheer volume of artillery and armored vehicles that a prolonged conventional war of attrition tends to reward. What Ukraine has developed instead is a rapidly scaling domestic drone production capability, allowing it to conduct strikes with weapons that are comparatively cheap to produce yet capable of reaching deep into Russian territory. This is a genuine asymmetric advantage, and using it against economically significant, symbolically resonant targets rather than purely military ones reflects a broader recognition that wars are not only won or lost on contested territory. They are also shaped by economic endurance and by which side's population is more willing to continue paying the costs involved. At the same time, it would be a mistake to read this campaign as a sign that Ukraine believes it can force a swift end to the war through strikes alone. Ukrainian officials have been careful to frame the campaign as part of a longer strategy of raising costs for Russia over time, rather than as a silver bullet capable of ending the conflict outright. This matters for expectations going forward. The value of the campaign lies less in any single spectacular strike and more in its cumulative, ongoing pressure, sustained month after month, which slowly reshapes both the Russian economic outlook and the domestic political environment Putin has to manage. There is also an important audience for this campaign beyond Russia itself, and that is Ukraine's Western partners, particularly in Washington. Continued effective long-range strikes serve as a visible demonstration that Ukraine still has meaningful offensive capability and has not been reduced to a purely defensive posture reliant entirely on outside support to hold the line. That message carries real weight at a moment when discussions about the future scale and duration of Western military assistance remain unsettled. Demonstrating battlefield initiative, even through unconventional means like drone strikes rather than large territorial advances, helps reinforce the case that continued support is not simply propping up a losing position but is instead sustaining a country still capable of shaping the course of the conflict. Ultimately, the picture that emerges is one of two sides locked into a war neither can currently win outright through conventional means alone. Russia lacks the manpower and momentum to achieve a decisive breakthrough in Donbas at its current pace, while Ukraine lacks the resources to launch a major offensive of its own without a significant and sustained increase in outside support. In that kind of stalemate, campaigns like the long-range strikes on Russian infrastructure and economically significant targets take on outsized importance because they represent one of the few tools available to shift the underlying calculus without requiring a battlefield breakthrough. Whether this pressure eventually pushes Moscow toward the negotiating table or instead hardens its resolve to continue fighting despite the costs will likely become clearer only in the months ahead as the durability of both Ukraine's campaign and Russia's economic resilience are tested in tandem.